Good morning. Cyrine, can I ask you to join us on the panel? I think we'll get started in 1 minute because we have a number of people online, so we don't want to keep them for much longer. Get started, just checking with the, is it okay? Yes, perfect. All right. Good morning, everyone. And good afternoon to those who are joining us online from the Middle East North Africa region. Sabah al-Khair. My name is Nadim Houry. I'm the Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative, an activist think tank with offices in Beirut, Tunis, and Paris, working on a number of issues, including pushing for more social justice in the Middle East, North Africa region, and I will be your moderator today. I'm also, on a personal level, very happy to be here, and thankful to Ford Foundation to giving us the space and this moment to reflect on the 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Our discussion this morning will focus on one of the rights in the UDHR that often, one of the articles that gets less attention, Article 22, but in my view, one of the key ones, which is the right to social protection, and perspectives from a region that usually gets attention for other sorts of human rights violations. But before we jump into this important and, in my view, very timely conversation, I think it's essential to maybe address the elephant in the room. And as we speak, in terms of the not only human rights, but also international humanitarian law, terrible violations we're witnessing, of course, in Gaza, but also across the region, from Syria to Yemen to Sudan to Libya. And usually human rights activists, and I consider myself one, we tend to repeat the mantra that human rights are indivisible and interdependent, because all rights, political, civil, social, cultural, and economic, are equal in importance, but also more importantly, that they cannot be enjoyed without the others. And I think this is very important for us to reflect on today, because they apply to all equally, and all have the right to participate in decisions that affect their lives. So I'm very glad we're going to be talking about the right to social protection, but I want us to all collectively keep in mind that these rights come as a package. And perhaps this is today the challenge for us as we celebrate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 75. This document that was not just born from the ashes of World War II, and it was not just born because European powers and the US, after the terrible Second World War, decided that this should never happen again. This document was created also by the efforts of a number of newly independent nations at the time, from South America, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Asia. And this is all documented, by the way, but that part of the history of UDHR doesn't often get the attention it deserves. And I think this is important to remember today, particularly because the institutions in charge of implementing and enforcing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights seem paralyzed. The double standards in applying human rights are glaring, and the temptation amongst many from different generations, from different political ideologies, to say things like human rights are dead is concerning, because I think there's a real risk of throwing the baby with the bathwater. yes, at 75, we need to redouble efforts so that rights regain not just a normative imperative, but that also they connect to a concrete impact on people's lives. And I think the issue of concrete impact on people's lives is a way to bring me back to our discussion today on social protection. Because when we talk about the MENA region, in 2011, during the Arab uprisings, people across the region took to the streets to demand freedom, dignity, and social justice. And yet, 12 years later, they are left with austerity, unemployment, and poverty. It was already one of the most unequal regions in the world, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And since the pandemic, that inequality gap has widened. Half of total income in the region goes to the top 10%, and the bottom half only receive 11% of the regional wealth. Now, all of us remember that the pandemic was hailed as an opportunity to build back better. I know I've used that phrase many, many times, but in practice, not only did we not build back better, frankly, for the marginalized and the poor, we did not build, period. The fragility of existing welfare and public protection programs was laid bare by the crisis and the subsequent period. As unemployment skyrocketed, rising energy and food prices pushed more people into poverty, and public debt surged in all countries across the region, with some getting into stratospheric debt. I come from Lebanon, but also countries like Tunisia, Egypt, barely surviving. Now, interestingly, this assessment of the situation and how dire it is and the need for social protection is shared today by a wide range of actors. So it's not only the Oxfams of this world who actually say the region needs better and more social protection. The June 2023 report by none other than the World Bank, titled Built to Include Reimagining Social Protection in the Middle East and North Africa. That could be a title that ARI would have produced, or Human Rights Watch, or FTDOS. Argued, this is the World Bank, that strong social protection policies are also essential in the region to reduce labor market exclusion by facilitating access to productive employment, protecting workers, and providing a safety net for the people that are left behind. So I think while there is today a convergence of interest in social protection in the region, the Oxfams of this world and the World Bank don't necessarily agree on what sort of social protection, what do we mean when we talk about it, by whom, to whom, and within what political project. And this is what we are here to discuss this morning. And I'm very lucky to be joined by a fantastic panel, a virtual hybrid event today with a number of us here in sunny, cold New York, but also with a couple of participants online. I don't know if we can turn the camera to see them. But I'll briefly introduce them. And then just the way the panel will go, it will be, there will be three rounds of questions that I'll ask. This will take us to about an hour and a half. And then we'll have half an hour for the Q&A. So I'll start online with Professor Rana Jawad. I don't know if Professor Rana is online. She is, yes. Who's Professor of Global Social Policy at the University of Birmingham in the UK. She specializes in social policies and welfare systems of the MENA region. She's worked for many years thinking about the questions of institutional and political change, program design, and impact of such programs on poverty and inequality. She's also a co-founder and convener of the MENA Social Policy Network, MENASP.com, which brings together academics and practitioners to share knowledge for the advancement of social policy and social justice issues in MENA. Good afternoon, Professor Jawad. We're also joined by Luca Pallerano, who is a senior protection specialist for the ILO on the Arab States region. He has provided technical assistance on the design, implementation, and evaluation of contributory and non-contributory social protection systems and programs in the Arab region, Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. And he is a co-chair of the UN Regional Issue-Based Coalition on Social Protection for the Middle East and North Africa countries. And Luca has been working, along with the ILO, very closely with a number of Arab governments to see how they can implement and reform their social protection systems. Good afternoon, Luca. Thank you for joining us. And with me here in the room, to my immediate right, my colleague, Farah Al Shami, who's a development economist and who's also a senior fellow and the program director of our social protection program at the Arab Reform Initiative. She has a number of years of experience, not just working with CSOs, academic institutes, and UN entities on advancing policy reforms, but really trying to bridge that gap between knowledge production and policy inputs. To my immediate left, Cyrine Ghannouchi, who's an independent policy researcher and a Tunis-based consultant in program development and strategic planning, working with a number of NGOs and research institutions in Tunisia and in the MENA region, and particularly with the Forum Tunisien des Droits Économiques et Sociaux, one of Tunisia's premier organizations working on social justice. We've had a chance to collaborate very closely, and she's really, over the last 5 years, been thinking about the design, management, implementation of projects related to migration, education, social protection, and really thinking about the nexus between social protection and the idea of the social contract. Thank you for being here, Cyrine. And last but not least, Sarah Saadoun, who's a senior researcher and advocate on economic justice and rights at Human Rights Watch. She's done many, many things, and our own trajectories have crisscrossed over the years, but in recent years, really her work has focused on integrating human rights into economic policy decisions of governments and international financial institutions, particularly the IMF. And I think it's going to be very interesting to have Sarah's perspective on organizations like HRW that are increasingly addressing and tackling issues of social justice and particularly social protection as a rights-based issue. So let me, I want to start this first round of questions by setting the context and really about contextualizing where we are at in the region, and particularly where we're at when it comes to social protection as a human right, where we're at with the discourse. And I'm going to start with the perspective of how governments in the region have approached this issue. I don't know if Dr. Jawad is with us on the line.
She might have joined back because she's facing audio issues and she left and she's trying to join back again.
If I can get a sign from the audio folks. Is yes. Dr. Jawad with us? Okay, well, then I will just start with Luca, and then we'll go with Dr. Jawad. Luca, you and the ILO have been involved in negotiations with various governments in the region in the last few years to get them to adopt a rights-based approach to social protection. And I guess we could say we're seeing some efforts, improvements in certain countries, in certain places. We saw Morocco, for instance, trying to expand social protection for people who were in the informal sector. We've probably seen some rollback by other governments. My two questions for you this morning is, are you seeing in this sort of post-pandemic, post-Arab uprisings, very difficult economic situation, are you seeing more governments adopt a rights-based approach to this issue? Particularly, I know the UN and you were involved in an effort that culminated with a ministerial forum declaration signed by countries in the region towards adopting a much more rights-based approach to social protection. Can you tell us about where you see governments are at today and where you see them in terms of implementing this ministerial forum declaration? And maybe you can tell us a bit more about it. If we can, 5 minutes, please, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure really being here. Thanks for the invitation, and also thanks for the opportunity to participate and reaffirm our joint commitment to realizing universal social protection rooted in the human rights framework paradigm, and informed an important element for the ILO by international labor standards and social security standards. And I think, as you have mentioned, the quest for social justice as a prerequisite for sustainable peace, which is, when you look at it from the ILO, at the core of our constitution. In 1919, the ILO was founded with these premises: there cannot be peace without social justice. I think that this strong link cannot be more important, I think, in the tragic times that we live in the region. It's really great that we have this chance to reflect on the role of social protection in the build-up of a more just and more peaceful Arab region. Maybe to set the scene, I can share a few statistics from the last edition of the World Social Protection Report, which is the global tool that the international community uses to track progress against the SDG indicator 1.3, which talks about our ambition, our collective ambition to extend social protection to all. And what that work tells us, and we are in the process actually of revisiting those statistics as we speak. So this is a pre-COVID picture in a sense, but it really gave us a stark picture of gaps in coverage. Only 4 in 10 people in the MENA region covered by any form of social protection. Only 1 in 4 children receiving any form of social protection benefits. 17% of persons with disabilities covered in social protection. Less than 10% of people in unemployment receiving benefits. And also when it comes to old age, perhaps an area where there has been a bit more focus, at least through contributory pension system, also telling us that only 4 in 10 people in old age in the region access social protection benefits. These are stark gaps, and also showing the region really lagging behind with comparators across the world. And of course, important gaps when it comes to specific population, women. I want to mention migrant workers. Maybe we'll come back to discuss that a bit more. Importantly, workers in diverse forms of employment, important gaps for the self-employed, for the temporary, seasonally, casually employed, you know, if you want the informal, informally employed as a whole. This comes also as a result of a very skewed financing picture in the region. When we compare MENA countries do spend on average 6% of their GDPs. And here I'm not talking just governments, but societies as a whole. Let's remember social protection is an area where there is a lot of direct financing from workers and employers through contributory systems. So the total of this investment, if you want, is about 6%, which is not far from the world average of 8% of GDP, but with, of course, great regional variation. And, you know, countries, especially fragile countries, really much more lagging behind in terms of spending, but also quite importantly, from an allocation of that spending, and very high concentration of spending on contributory systems. More than 65% of total spending is on contributory systems, which tend to benefit only formal workers, predominantly public sector workers, in some cases with very significant spending on schemes for the military. And the space for spending, public spending on what we call social assistance or programs for vulnerable categories in the population is really much reduced, only 1.5% of GDP across the region. So it's clearly a picture of gaps and of the region that hasn't really put social protection at the center of its social contract, which has been much more dominated by the notion of public employment and universal subsidies. And of course, that paradigm coming into stress, or, you know, has really been challenged in terms of its economic sustainability and the successive austerity policies, having led to a movement towards more targeted safety nets on the one hand, and also a removal of subsidies on the other, are leaving important gaps. COVID certainly, as you mentioned, has been a big revelation of what we call the missing middle, these millions of disenfranchised citizens, if you want, who are not poor enough to be picked by the safety nets, at the same time not formal enough to be covered through the regular contributory systems. And really, I think hopefully our discussion today can focus on how to put at the center of this agenda for universal social protection this missing middle and what makes it and what solutions can be found to address this gap in coverage. You've mentioned the regional declaration, which was adopted by ministers responsible for social protection across the region in the immediate aftermath of the COVID pandemic. It's encouraging that I think countries in the region have given more focus and more attention to the topic, and certainly during the COVID period, this has been there's been a lot of emphasis on the role of social protection. The question is what remains of that. Maybe we can discuss it further, but just to highlight from the regional declaration, interesting that there is a strong commitment to rights and life cycle based social protection floors as opposed to targeted social protection. The idea of progressively reviewing effort to expand social protection to vulnerable groups, and it explicitly mentioned children, older persons, persons with disabilities, women, and workers in the informal economy. And also the recognition of social protection as a right to workers in all types of employment. So there are then references to the need to adopt more shock responsive approaches to social protection, also to look at better financing, including by a better mix of contributory and tax finance sources to finance, which I think is, of course, a critical element here to bring in the discussion not only what type of social protection, but how to finance social protection in a way that is progressive, because we know that at the end of the day, social protection and tax systems are sort of two sides of the same coin, and we can't really de-link one agenda from the other. And then a call also for social dialogue and stronger coordination. Please wave when I'm running out of time so I can start wrapping up.
I don't know if
am I already?
Yes, but we'll come back because I think you gave us a lot to think about, and that we're seeing perhaps particularly in the aftermath of COVID, governments that are at least paying lip service to the idea, as you mentioned, saying that a life cycle, a rights-based approach to social protection, but also you mentioned a commitment to social dialogue when we know, frankly, that in the region, space for social dialogue, space for labor unions, space for mobilizing for rights remain very limited. But that brings me, perhaps I'll turn it over because I think Dr. Jawad was having problems connecting. So maybe I'll just shift to my colleague Farah to, you've been working on pushing the issue of social protection, not just with governments, but also with civil society. And historically in the region, I think Luca was already talking about, the issue of social dialogue. We didn't talk about the reality and the limited space for unions to push for some of these issues. But one of the notable absences as well was that the voices from civil society articulating and demanding a rights-based approach to social protection has been limited in recent years. It has been increasing, but I think compared to some other regions, this space has been limited. Though we have seen, in response to the gaps, the terrible gaps that Luca was describing, various forms of other solidarities coming up. We've also seen in the aftermath of 2011, but particularly during and after COVID, finally civil society trying to articulate more of these demands. Can you give us a few examples of what sort of mobilization you're seeing in recent years? Can you give us a few examples or your take on whether the notion of the right to social protection is resonating more in different segments, particularly that you've been very much involved in setting up Arab Region Hub for social protection and trying to create spaces for interactions between civil society activists and policymakers.
Yes, sure. Thanks, Nadim. So before we start speaking about civil society, it is important to also mention the level of public awareness in general, because things like happen sequentially when it comes to the understanding of the concept of social protection. And if we are to speak to that, I can easily say that the level of public awareness about social protection as a concept is poor overall. It is very poor in the Arab region. The general public does not know that many of the socioeconomic demands that they voice out in protests during their day-to-day life, their struggles, they don't know that this is or should be framed as social protection as a concept. They don't also know that social protection, or whatever is named directly as social protection, like, for example, the National Social Security Fund, they don't know that this is their right. They don't know that their right as a citizen, their right as a resident, and that it is the responsibility of the state. So they don't have this understanding of this concept. Social protection is an old practice. It's not part of the modern state, but it's a new concept. And this new concept hasn't yet been grasped by the general population. This is a reflection of the level of public education about rights in general in our region, and is also a reflection of the culture of law that is absent. And we have a paper that has been written by an expert for us at the Arab Reform Initiative, and it says that in countries where the common law is basically prevalent, the culture of law is stronger, and this is not the case in the Arab region. We are missing that. We're missing the culture of rights, and I mean the lack of this understanding of the concept is due to broken or frail or inexistent social contracts. We do not have social contracts in the Arab region. Citizens aren't paying their taxes. If they have the option, they opt for private insurance, for private social pensions. If they are to choose between private and public, they always opt for the private solution, because they do not have trust in public systems. They do not have trust in public institutions. And at the same time, on the other hand, we look at the state and we see that Arab states are also not assuming their responsibility, and as part of a reflection of the broken social contract, the state doesn't collect taxes or doesn't collect it well. They don't even enforce law. So this is a sign that the concept of citizenship in the first place is absent. The concept of citizenship is basically subordinated to the group, the family, tribe, sect, party. So there is always a supra-individual entity or unit, and this is tangled to the culture of entitlement on both sides, on the sides of the citizens, maybe residents we can count as well, and the state. Now for CSOs, if we are to speak about this concept and how civil society is trying to improve this whole status quo. Civil society is a very broad term, and it's not homogeneous, particularly in the Arab region. It can include NGOs, academia, labor unions, labor movement more broadly. So there is also a certain level of discrepancy as to how civil society understands this concept. The knowledge-producing NGOs or the think tanks are very aware. The level of awareness on this level is the best, we can say, especially if they are independent, especially if they are on the left-leaning side. They're not like neoliberal mainstream kind of knowledge-producing civil society. Then in the second place comes academia, and not all of academia. It comes the academia that is not coming from disciplinary mainstream approaches, but that is coming more from a social policy, public policy kind of training or discipline or field, basically. And in the last place comes the activists and the grassroots movements, the labor movements, the labor union. They are trying to join this momentum, to follow suit, basically, but on a slower pace. Now, even the civil society that is independent and that is working a lot on social protection even within this circle, if we are to say, even that it is not homogeneous, the understanding of social protection is not homogeneous at all as a concept. But we are seeing, so between the mainstream and the liberal and the left-leaning, there is definitely a huge discrepancy, but even amongst the independent, because this is a new concept, we still see flawed understanding. They still mix the social assistance with the social safety nets. They still mix the poverty targeting with certain kinds of allowances. So there is always, they don't know what exactly a grant is and what exactly it is that we are trying to advance and what is it that we aren't or that we don't want. But we are seeing more effort to basically unify this discourse. And this is very important. Why is it important? Because as an civil society, independent think tanks, the independent knowledge-producing civil society as an entity, if we are to look at it like this, is facing other stakeholders. It's facing some international organizations, international financial institutions, government officials, and these have yet another understanding of social protection. And sometimes this understanding can be so different that it causes some kind of dichotomies. So overall, it has become more common to hear about social protection as a right, as part of a social contract. We're speaking more about the concept of universality versus targeting, but we are sensing the need to educate more and to build capacities more, whether engagement capacity or technical capacity. And this education and capacity building is on two specific levels that we need.
Just joined, so she can only be with us 20 minutes. So if you can just
yeah, I'll wrap up just this idea and maybe I can continue later. So we do need to educate and build the capacity of two key actors, the layman first, and we know why, and second, the unusual suspects. And I'm quoting here Zina Nami, our colleague. The unusual suspects, which are basically the mid-level social protection specialists, because we are seeing a sort of a polarization. It's either we are seeing high-level experts which have or who have a high level of awareness about the topic, or we are seeing the operationalists that are very interventionist and that are unintentionally leveraging this like kind of patronage clientelistic system that is going on. But I can elaborate on this later, Nadim. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. And I think we have Dr. Rana Jawad with us now. If yes, no, I got a message saying she was, but I think maybe the problem is not. She's not there. No.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Dr. Jawad. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you.
I know you're having difficulty with the connection, so I'll just go straight to ask you a question. It would be great, given your long experience working on this, and in sort of 5 to 7 minutes, if you can tell us a bit about how the genesis and evolution of the notion of social protection in the Arab region has developed. More specifically, I think if we look at the brief history, post-independence, many of the governments thought of social protection not necessarily as a right, but it was their way of extending their patronage networks, as well with their, at this time, Arab socialist ideology. We saw things like, in Egypt, in Syria, and a number of other countries developing this. This wasn't necessarily part of a social contract in the traditional sense of, you vote for us, and so forth. This was very much another form of local social contract of, in a way, creating new forms of obedience. With the neoliberal reforms of the 80s and afterwards, and I actually asked you this question, where is the relationship between the state and the citizen when it comes to social protection? Because I think we saw the state retreat away from providing these services, relying again, I think, on some of the networks that Farah was describing, traditional societal support for these issues. Are we seeing perhaps, do you see opportunities, spaces for a renewed demand for state-led social protection? Is the state, Luca was talking about the declaration, I think that the state, particularly after a decade of uprisings, realizing that they need to provide more services. Your take on some of these complex historical and policy issues?
Okay, thank you very much, Nadim. Yeah, sorry everyone, my internet's down, so I've relied on my phone, and thank you very much to your technician, Hussein, who helped me connect through my phone. So just to respond to Nadim's question, so I think the question began from since the 1980s. The first thing I would say is I think it's important to differentiate between social protection and social policy and the range of allied public services or basic services such as health, education, in-kind, in-cash support. And there's a range of areas that we would include under social policy broadly. Social protection is primarily about income maintenance. When the household or the individual lose their income because of loss of job or illness, where does the alternative income come from? So I think in that sense, it's very important to assess what the MENA governments and particularly the Arab governments have been doing in relation to social protection within this complex context of social protection being particularly about alternative sources of income that may be lost, how they are substituted, and of course the financing of these. It's fair to say that all of the Arab countries historically, as you all know, and certainly including since the 1990s, have employment-based social insurance provisions. Of course, the population numbers that benefit from these forms of employment-based social insurance are primarily those in the formal private and public sectors. We know that the public sector workers have historically had very generous access to insurance of all sorts, including health and supplements for education and family costs. And of course, we know that there is a very large informal sector in the Arab countries. And many of these informal sector workers choose to work in the informal sector. And we know from data and evidence from a range of surveys conducted regionally or including by donor agencies that the informal sector is quite active. So we're looking at a very complex situation. Clearly, since the 1990s, with the emphasis on liberalization, on dealing with the government deficits and debt, and of course the volatility of oil prices, and which clearly affects economic circumstances in the region, and of course intermittent conflict. It is very much the case that the access to adequate levels of social protection and the provision of adequate coverage for the entire population in any of the Arab countries has diminished. Now, an important caveat is that the presence of social protection does not necessarily correlate with the type of political economic context that the country has. And you made a reference to the socialist regimes, Nadim, thank you. But we know from legislation, we know from data around socioeconomic outcomes in a range of countries with a range of political regimes that there have been provisions that have varied regardless of the type of regime that exists in the country. Perhaps one of the more important determinants of the access to social protection, and certainly for levels of poverty, is the vulnerability to conflict and internal war, civil war, or other forms of conflict that affect that particular country context. And there is data to show this across the region. So having said so, yes, but this is a trend, I think, it is a trend in terms of the diminishing capacity of social protection to address, to cover the whole population, to address the rising costs of living. We see these across high income and low income countries and middle income countries. This is not just a factor affecting the MENA countries as such, although of course we know that there are there's a particular problematic in the MENA region because of the very high consistent levels of poverty, very high and consistent levels of populations vulnerable to poverty, which clearly crises like the COVID pandemic magnified. And we know that economically, this is a region that's been characterized by jobless growth for several decades. So clearly there is a responsibility on governments and policymakers to address the needs and the increasing social and economic challenges in the MENA region. The donor agencies and the international donor community has certainly stepped in. As we all know, there is a major reform of particularly the subsidy system and the social protection programs to reduce budget deficits for governments, and there is certainly an emphasis on making efficiencies and freeing up fiscal space in order to fund new types of social assistance, which would fall under the social protection rubric. And various governments have embraced this, engaged with this approach to varying degrees of success. We know Egypt and Jordan in particular have implemented major reforms and have tried to expand their employment-based or other forms of social security systems to incorporate their populations. The dependence on international donor funding is significant and important, and of course a major question for the sustainability of these programs, particularly when MENA countries don't really rely on taxation and in-source for finance systems, and we know that these two are very connected. This doesn't mean that there aren't other types of basic services which might support social protection. Would you like me to stop there?
Please, because I think we'll come back about some of the challenges and the issues of fiscal space. But just as we were finishing the sort of tour de table on the issue, I just want to go back. I want to go to you, Cyrine, to talk about something that actually has sort of come up already in the conversation, which is this: the right to social protection often requires and assumes a stronger presence of the state. And what we've heard from Luca, from Rana, from Farah as well, is that the programs that exist have often been employment-based, and we know that the large segments of society are in what's called the informal sector, and often in this informality, and there are structural economic aspects to it, but there is also this notion, I think a lot of your research working on the hawamish, on the margins in Tunisia, you've noticed that often citizens and residents of these communities often do not want to associate with the state, because often it is seen as a predatory state, it is often seen as a repressive state. And I think to go back to this notion of, and I think we'll get back into it, you need more taxation, but if the state is not perhaps seen as representative or fully legitimate, you don't want to get taxed, so you'd rather operate on the margin. And this brings back to this notion of, how do these groups in your research, these groups in the informal sector, tend to think about social protection and the right to it? And is one way to bridge that issue that we're facing today is going through a new political demand for a new form of social contract? Just very curious if you can share with us some of the key findings from your research on sort of marginal populations, the social contract, and how it relates to social protection.
Thank you, Nadim. Well, I think that as a prerequisite to the discussion of social protection from a social contract outlook, there's a need to think of the presence of the states, not only as a presence or absence, but to look at or examine how the state is present, where is it present and when, but also why is it absent and where and when. Now, regarding the tendency of some groups or the margins in general to not engage with the state or to withdraw, well, first, this does not mean that there is no interaction at all, or there are no frictions, or that the margins are just silent, inactive by definition. It's all the contrary. And speaking of the informal or groups under the informal label, I'd say, because formal and informal really depend on your standing points. These groups do not think of themselves as informal. So this is a state-led definition. It's the state that decides what's formal and what's informal. So regarding this tendency, it actually translates, well, first, we're not talking about a minority. Today, the margins are really expanding. So I think that this space that is inherently political is absorbing more and more fractions of society. And the second point is that this rupture is not only with the state, at least in the case of Tunisia, fieldwork revealed that it's also a rupture with non-state actors. And this is an important element of the discussion when thinking about the role of CSOs, for example. So yes, one driver is the protection of their informal modes of survival, resistance, etc., from the behavior of the state. But there's more to it, actually. It's also a reaction to what they endured invisibility, in a sense. So they're also protecting what's left of some dignity, in the sense that we're super done with the instrumentalization of the suffering of these people for political purposes, void promises, unmet demands, etc., etc. So we'll do it our way. And internally, these groups, whether in groups or in between these groups, are very resourceful. And yes, through forms that do predate the modern state. And the second driver is that it is also a way to express dissent. It is a way to say that we do exist and we're not okay with what's happening, and we do have our alternatives. Now, whether or not the state is ready to engage with these alternatives or not is a different part of the discussion. So are these groups, do these groups think of social protection as a right? There's this rupture in general, or this withdrawal from engagement with the state in codified terms, is coupled with the renunciation to rights in general, be it social protection or else. But the question, I think, that is whether social protection was ever thought of as a right. And I think that this question calls for a very historically grounded understanding, the origins of social protection in the region, from the outlook of, or the colonial project, to then post-independence states and the state building phase. But I think that the 2011 moment, at least, translated an awareness or an understanding of rights in a more comprehensive way. But that moment was captured, seized, deviated, whatever. I mean, it's a different discussion. And today, it's not that there is no social contracts, but the old social contract has been eroded in a way. It's not functioning anymore. And at the same time, there is no new social contract. And spaces of negotiation of this social contract, as you mentioned in the introduction, it really depends on the political project ongoing. Now, this...
Yes, you have just 30 seconds.
Oh, well.
No, we'll have another round because...
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so 30 seconds, I would just say that I just wanted to talk about, it's not social protection per se, as the words we use, the different words, but these margins do have modes of social protection embedded culturally in their organic ways of organization. And I think that this is very informative to social policy design in general, social protection programs design. And at the same time, as we're speaking, there's really structural mutations happening. And we can talk like for hours about this. And if we're talking about what should be done, and we'll talk later more about this, is that these groups, they are weakened. It's not sustainable, yes. They're deeply affected. Even these modes of survival are deeply affected. But at the same time, they're not ready to engage with any response that does not bring justice, because this is the demand today.
No, and I think it's very important. And I realize we're having the conversation on multiple levels, right? We're having it at a political, conceptual, and technical, and that's challenging. It challenges what words we use. And I forgot to mention, for those of you on Zoom, there's simultaneous translation to Arabic. Sorry, I'm being a bad moderator. I should have announced this at the beginning. And if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A, and I will be getting them on my phone. But taking, I think we on the region, we've looked at different dynamics going on. What's happening at the government level, at the technical policy level, at the civil society, at the, I'm going to call it maybe the informal social movements or non-movements, the disengagement. But I want to now come also at another level, which is at the level of the international human rights movement. And Sarah, you've been pushing, and you've led some of the work at Human Rights Watch, directly engaging on the right to social protection. You actually have a global campaign, the right to social security, which we're collaborating, and we're all together at the IMF World Bank meetings. But it's also interesting to see an organization like Human Rights Watch today sees the issue of economic and social rights in a much more direct and frontal manner than the past. And so can you tell us from your perspective, from where you're sitting, how you are approaching the question of the right to social security, which, and this notion of the right to social protection, giving meaning to that famous Article 22 in UDHR that we're discussing today. But also perhaps, as you think about this, what sort of challenges, both conceptual, but also around methodology, you have had to confront, and how you've seen your partnership with local groups, both from CSOs, but also perhaps social movements, or existent or non-existent or corrupted trade unions, all of that, and also 5 minutes, because I realize where, but I think we'll just have another round. So the floor is yours, Sarah.
Small task. Thank you, Nadim. And it's particularly poignant for me to represent Human Rights Watch in this discussion on social protection and MENA at the 75th anniversary of the UDHR, because in many ways it was the Arab Spring that forced the focus back on economic and social rights across the world, but also at Human Rights Watch. I mean, listening to the discussion, it's clear the extent to which MENA, the region, exemplifies how entangled poverty and authoritarianism are, and how they enforce each other and entrench each other and have to be confronted together. And this message reverberated across the world from the Arab Spring, but I want to take a moment to recognize how it inspired Occupy Wall Street, because that, for me, is a symbol of how closely connected it was to the financial recession of 2008. Not only the crisis itself, which was triggered by a belief in deregulated markets, and that eventually came crashing down on people as a small group of people made enormous amounts of money, but also the response to the crisis, and which imposed austerity and took a chainsaw to economic and social rights across the world, exacerbating poverty and inequality, and shamefully, with Human Rights Watch and similar organizations saying very little about how that impacted people's economic and social rights. But it did set a spark that that brought it onto the agenda. And I think that's sort of brought the organization to a place where especially in the wake of COVID, it realized that there is no ignoring economic and social rights. It's too crucial an issue, not to people across the globe, but also to civil and political rights. And here I want to mention my brilliant colleague Lena Simmet, who couldn't be here, but she's I mean, it was kind of a marketing ploy to call us a poverty and equality team, because when we started out, we were really like, 1.5 people. But she was the person who first brought the right to Social Security into Human Rights Watch. And there were a few reasons why we really focused on that. And I want to kind of unpack that a little bit now. So first of all, the right to Social Security is a right in and of itself, and as you mentioned, not one that gets a lot of attention. And that's really, it's a really important right. Only half the world has any form of social protection, but as Luca mentioned, in the MENA region, it's even less than that, with 1 in 4 people having access to any form of social protection. But it's also a really important right for the fulfillment of other economic and social rights. And so it's important not only of itself, but also for broader realization of economic and social rights. And then the third reason is because in some ways it sets the has a foundational role in economies that are aligned with human rights. Because for various reasons, one of them is its redistributive function. So Nadim, when we started, you mentioned how the inequality across the Middle East, and how, I forget exactly the numbers, but something like the top 10% capturing half of the wealth, and the bottom 50% only 11%. And so social protection plays a really important role in redistributing resources within a society and bringing inequality down. And in doing so, it builds, we've heard the word social contract a number of times, but it builds a form of social solidarity and a trust in government that is really kind of sets in place a foundation for a social contract that in which a whole range of rights are able to be realized. And so I think it's, I'm just checking how much minutes I have left. I think it's really important in that regard. And I want to get to your question about challenges, because I think it is really challenging to work on social protection or economic and social rights in an organization like Human Rights Watch that has been focused on civil and political rights for a number of reasons. First, I think it requires a paradigm shift on how we think about governments. And this has come up, I think, in a lot of people's a lot of remarks on this panel, where when you're focused on government abuses, you're looking at naming and shaming, about holding accountable, about raising the cost. I mean, these are words that are often used in at Human Rights Watch. Our motto is "Tyranny has a witness," and so. Of course, the end goal is for governments that respect rights, but in constantly shaming and describing the ways in which governments are abusive and repressive, we also run the risk of delegitimizing governments themselves. And when we're looking at economic and social rights, what we're actually trying to build is a better, healthier presence for governments. And so we need to look at it from a very different way. That doesn't mean that there's no room for shaming governments where they violate rights or don't do enough in support of economic and social rights. But it does create a need for a different type of relationship where, in addition to calling out, bad faith actions and straight kind of disregard for people, it also requires identifying good faith actors who might lack support or capacity or ideas or solutions for very deep-seated problems. And I think that this is hard for an organization that is used to naming and shaming.
Can I come back to you to do another round?
Okay,
yes.
Okay.
I just want to I want to shift, and we'll maybe a quick round of questions. If each of you could identify what you consider perhaps 1 or 2 key challenges towards moving in the region towards a recognition of rights to social protection. I mean, we've already talked a bit about indebted governments, with limited fiscal space. We've talked about, Rana Jawad spoke about conflicts. We talked about bad governance. Farah, you were starting to talk about as well the NGOization of social protection delivery, the shrinking civic spaces. I don't know if Rana is still with us on the line. And if you are, Rana, maybe I'll just, in 3 minutes, can you tell us from your perspective, given all your work on this, what you see as the major challenges today facing efforts to expand social protection? And particularly as an academic who've been working on social policy generally for many, many years, interested for you to maybe reflect on the role of knowledge producers and researchers, particularly academics, in bridging that gap between your research and policies. And do you see that today as a challenge towards realization of more rights? Or do you see the real challenge is not at the level of the technical understanding and the solutions, but rather at the political level? Maybe 3-4 minutes, please, Max.
Yeah, thank you, Nadim. Sorry, as I was concentrating on the second half of your question, I then forgot the first half.
What you see as the major challenges to moving forward?
Okay. I think what always strikes me in this region, both on paper and speaking with policymakers, is that, and I don't think this is just lip service, legislation in this region has, and perhaps Luca may well correct me, but I do come across this, that legislation in this region will refer to social security as being a right to citizens, or certainly social security as in access to social insurance and income support related to employment, or generally defined more broadly. This is in the legislations and constitutions of many of the Arab countries and referred to in different ways. I was amazed recently reading about Libya, for example. There is very much in the law coverage of child protection and income support for children and families. So I think there is a very patchy landscape that we're seeing. And I think the challenge for these countries is implementing these discourses and where they have them, these laws fully. And it's across the region, from the Arab Gulf states, which again, I'm sure Luca can say more, to the North African countries, and backing this up with adequate financing and adequate systems of management, whereby governments know what they are, what revenue is coming in, and they know what the profile of the labor market is. So I think certainly, the financing aspect is really critical, which over decades of erosion of the systems go hand in hand. But again, the experiences vary across the countries. Contexts like Jordan and Egypt, to a certain extent Morocco, the Arab Gulf states are in another category, but these are countries that are trying to reform to the extent that they can. So I think that the discourses are there, but it's about implementing them, and it's about ensuring that partisan affiliations don't interfere with the responsibilities of the state. Yeah, and I think this is obviously one of the primary difficulties in this region, that public and private interest intersect, and hence, we have lots of reservations about how the state acts. In terms of research and knowledge, I can only say, the reality, which is that there are many able and leading researchers across the region. I've been able to collaborate with many colleagues through the MENA Social Policy Network that we co-founded, which I think some of you may be familiar with. There are many researchers working on particular policy areas. Of course, employment, trade, gender issues are really key, but increasingly we have, there is also lots of focus on family policy, child protection. So there are areas of specialism that exist, and these researchers have direct contact with ministries of social solidarity, ministries of planning. They work directly with the international donor community. They are very much located within their country context, but they do speak the language of international scholarship and international policy making. And I think that is perhaps more where the issue lies. This specialist knowledge needs to be translated down. I don't mean that in any sort of, not suggesting down hierarchically, but what I mean is that it does need to be translated through the institutions of education. I mean, look at what universities teach, for example. How many teach courses on social protection, social policy, public policy analysis? They are few and far between. And so I think the education system needs to reflect this better. And clearly, lower down in the secondary school system and the primary school system, there needs to be a connection with these wider concepts that do relate to rights, to social security, and the role of the state.
Thank you, Rana. Sorry to interrupt you. I mean, we'll come back. Just
we can go on
because we have.
I also need to apologize that I must leave. I'm very, very sorry. But thank you very much for inviting me. I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. And I think, Rana was connecting some things you were talking about, for almost like the demand side, more awareness. But I want to go first to Luca. Luca, is Luca still with us?
I'm here.
Okay. At the ILO, I mean, we heard Rana talk about sometimes patchy laws, sometimes the challenge of financing, of actually implementing these issues. Obviously, in some aspects, the political will. As the ILO, I mean, I know you often work on training public sector employees on issues of social protection. I'd be interested to hear from your perspective what you see as the sort of top challenges to moving forward on this. Particularly, is it the issue of the capacity of the public sector to enact such reforms? Is the issue, we talked a bit about the shrinking spaces and maybe a labor movement that's also fragmented, and often labor movement is essential to push for such demands. I mean, from where you're sitting, where do you see as the biggest obstacles?
Thanks, you, Nadim. I mean, it's clearly all these things you've mentioned, but I want to focus on one element that for me or for us in the experience of these few years is key, which is really to support or the lack of a clear narrative or paradigm about the role that social protection could play in the new social contract that we have been discussing here. I feel like there is a need to deconstruct and reconstruct the pieces of a model of social protection that was perhaps designed in industrial countries in the global north and doesn't necessarily fit with the needs, the context. By the way, not even to the global north anymore. If you look at the new relationship between capital and labor and the way that's fundamentally changing in the way economies operate, but also the fact that the promise on full decent employment is clearly unfulfilled for large segment of the population, as we were mentioning, and in some cases there is no functioning state capacity or legitimacy. So the risk with I see at the moment is oversimplification of social protection as just being giving cash transfers to the poor, be it by the government or by humanitarian international community. And there is much more to social protection than that, but that requires in a way to see the social protection ecosystem and the different pieces in it and their interrelation for a more complex angle. And that calls in question the need to rethink the relationship between contributory and non-contributory systems. Some people, some agencies you've mentioned, the World Bank have been very much calling for a narrative that says social insurance is dead. We don't need social insurance anymore. We can leave it to the private sector to sort out employment-related risks, and all focus should be on social assistance, where from the ILO perspective, that's quite concerning, but also how to articulate the role of social protection and access to health and education and the interrelation there. And finally, the key interrelation between social protection and employment activation, formalization, which is critical. Now, in rebuilding this narrative, or rethinking how the pieces of this jigsaw can be matched in a way that is relevant to the region, I think there are three issues that I feel are missing from the debate. One is that social protection should be in as much as supporting upward income mobility as much as also avoiding downward income mobility. There has been too much focus on policy solutions to reduce poverty and perhaps not sufficient focus on the need to prevent policy, to protect the middle class, to avoid fall into poverty. And in that sense, we have found that often it's much more efficient also to protect families from falling into poverty as opposed to having to go and imagine paths out of poverty. Again, this calls for a much wider set of policy instruments, not just cash transfers, but life cycle benefits that address those demographic and employment-related risks that lead to falling into poverty, as well as social insurance. The second element, I think, is really that poverty is much more dynamic than some of us may want to think. There are really no fixed categories as poor and non-poor, but instead a really much more fluid movement of households in and out of poverty. Some work we did in the West Bank shows that within the span of 5 years, only 16% of households have remained poor. So in this context, poverty targeting is often an optical illusion. Some of us think that we can actually identify and target the poor, but our tools at targeting the poor are always lagging behind by 5, 6, 10 years. So we're always behind target. That's really where a rights-based approach needs to put into focus the need to, again, prevent in a much more inclusive manner that downward mobility. And the final point quickly is really on the relationship between legal access and effective access. In one sentence, there are way too many countries where legal access do not translate into effective access because of lack of channels for voice, for representation, for legal disputes, and for exercise of those rights through the administrative process that would lead to those benefits being accessible. And we can talk a bit more about that, but clearly digital technology there can be a big accelerator, but too little investment has been made into turning those legal rights, where they're existing, into effective access to benefits.
Great. Thank you very much, Luca. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and how the solution is not just about laws. It might not be about even implementation, but also challenging us to think of what is the model for a truly inclusive and a rights-based approach in the region for this day and age. And I want to come back to you, Farah, to really talk about, like, as we sort of transition of thinking about the challenges and how we go forward. You've been involved in trying to, in your first intervention, you described a civil society with different actors approaching the issue with different understandings, and that's normal, but trying to kind of create a big tent movement for people to advocate, to, in a way, create the demand side, to create that space for some of the dialogues and policy discussions that Luca is talking about. Can you tell us a bit more about the experience of creating the Arab Region Hub for Social Protection, trying to create this space through the declaration of kind of demand, a reflection, a recognition that, I think as Cyrine was talking about, in a way, the old model is dead, the new model is not yet born, so we need to kind of take the time to challenge ourselves, to maybe use the appropriate words. We're talking about different kinds of terminology in English. We need to also do this with Arabic. We need to, but in addition to just the actual term, what meaning we attach to these terms. So can you tell us a bit about that strategy, what it tells you, what you see as perhaps, a challenge, but maybe an opportunity of building these bridges, both within the region, but also, I think, through your collaboration, for instance, with international organizations for advocacy and participating in a more global dialogue, because again, there is no exception in the region. I think what Luca was talking about is something that rings true across many parts of the world, clearly in the global south, but also clearly in a number of northern countries that themselves are struggling with the system, particularly in this country, in the US, of people falling through the cracks.
So thanks again, Nadim. Yes, actually, during the COVID era, we felt that there was already an ecosystem working and interested in social protection, social policy more broadly, but it was a bit shy. It was more like sporadic, like the efforts were very scattered. Now we have a current ecosystem that is emerging. And that seems to be having a more subliminal understanding of social protection, as in that is not an aid, that is not a service, it's not a commodity, but it's a process. And they're working, like this current ecosystem is working on that basis without even maybe being conscious of it. We see that although it is an emerging ecosystem, but it is a bit more cohesive, it is more determined. Perhaps it's because COVID has exposed our social protection systems, perhaps because of the social movements, the Arab Spring, because the funding was geared in this direction. There could be many reasons, but we have recently seen a shift from a surgical or transactional work on social protection. Before COVID, it was only an organization publishing a paper, an organization publishing a policy brief, and it stopped there. This is how it used to be. We saw a shift from that to something that is more to a movement, to mobilization, something that is more genuine. We see more commitment on the part of the partners, more dedication. We see what I call positive contamination as well. So partners are encouraging each other to take up this cause and to work for it. And we're seeing more collective action, like partnerships, collaboration. So, and this ecosystem is now, it comprises international organizations and UN agencies. The ILO is one of them, UNICEF, WFP, ESQA even, independent not-for-profit think tanks and the knowledge-producing NGOs. Even the humanitarian NGOs are now part of this movement. Some academia, but we're seeing it less so on the level of media and on the level of activists. We don't see activists that are dedicated for the social protection as a cause. We may see activists that are dedicated for socioeconomic rights in general, but not for social protection, and so is the case with the media. But it's mostly human rights or organizations that follow a human rights-based approach, that have always worked on socioeconomic rights, that are basically driving forth in this ecosystem. Now the hub is a network, okay? The Arab Region Hub for Social Protection. It is a network. It was first established to basically join this community of practice and knowledge, to bring it together and to bridge the gap between the different actors that are of which this ecosystem is constitutes of, to bridge the gap between academia and civil society, between both and the policymakers, for example. So the hub is trying to help this ecosystem have a more, on the level of the Arab region we're speaking, to have a more of a coordinated vision, more of a coordinated messaging, to provide a continual space for exchange and dialogue on different dimensions of the topic, to keep the momentum with little financial resources, because we don't want our work to be only pending or contingent on whether there is funding or not. We want this momentum to stay, because again, it's a cause. Now the Arab Region Hub for Social Protection has taken a flat structure where everyone can fit, can belong, can feel comfortable contributing. It's basically aiming at, because we saw during COVID that everybody was working on this, on the topic. So we wanted a space, that turns this like duplication of effort into more partnership, more synergies, to help people join forces to make a stronger impact, given the political-economic challenges that we are facing, the closed policy spaces that we are facing. We need to have concerted efforts to be able to be a stronger critical mass and make the desired impact. And there isn't such a platform in the Arab region. We see such a platform on the global level, but not in the Arab region. So this is why we value this, like the fact that all partners are also collaborating with us. Now the hub is providing a website, which is a go-to place on the topic. It's providing a news digest because we want to educate. It's convening the different stakeholders all the time. it has provided a campaign called the 26 Days of Activism for Social Protection that is spanning the period between World Health Day and International Labor Day, and it has provided the declaration. Why is it so? Because these different actors that belong to the ecosystem have different strategies, and we noticed that some of them are more focused on mapping and monitoring government policies like CESRA, for example. Some of them more on producing educational infographics, others on knowledge production, others on campaigning like the Phoenix Center. But we wanted to bring all of these together, and we wanted this declaration to do two things. One of them is to define the hub, who we are, what are we trying to do, as if it's like an informal MOU between us. And the second is basically to unify the discourse, because going back to the concepts, we need to agree on our understanding, the concepts, the definition, and our position vis-a-vis the different parts. We tried to draft the declaration as if we were thinking, what is the social contract that we want, or part of the social contract that we want when it comes to social protection? And this is what we tried to basically embody in the declaration. And this is very important because Luca was speaking about the ministerial declaration. And to be able, for instance, to collaborate with Luca, and we're already discussing premises for collaboration, to give civil society organizations a platform to basically hold the signatories of the ministerial declaration not necessarily accountable, but to question them, to ask them about their progress, what are the challenges they have faced, what opportunities do they see with themselves. We cannot do this if we are not acting as a unit. As a unit. And the second thing is that I would like to reiterate that even the independent knowledge-producing civil society, they are still very confused about the concepts. Like we've seen even some of them confused between humanitarian interventions and poverty-targeted social safety nets. So we needed such a document to basically bring people together, because otherwise the discourse, because we are more on the most civil society organizations are ideological, the discourse can get too radical. And when it gets radical, this is counterproductive, because sometimes governments make progress, but we don't realize that. And we keep attacking them, whereas they are making progress. And this is indeed counterproductive.
I think this joins as well. I think the point that Sarah was making about this unease, perhaps, when you're a human rights activist, to think about small steps and progress. But Cyrine, I want to come back to you. And I think we've heard the word social contract come up a lot in this conversation. And in a recent paper you actually published with us at the Arab Reform Initiative, you mentioned that a social contract should not only be about socioeconomic rights and access to social services, but also about political participation and state legitimacy. And just very briefly, because I want to also give a chance to a Q&A, but this notion of political participation as a prerequisite to enacting socioeconomic rights, ultimately, which goes back to this notion of legitimacy. You know, you've been working on Tunisia. You already talked about the sort of notion of margins and how they are, you know, and how they are expressing themselves. Tunisia has been going through a process, I guess what we would consider a detransition away, perhaps, from democracy, a shrinking space. What do you see today as the major obstacles towards this push for more socioeconomic rights, given your thinking about these issues?
Thank you. Well, to begin with, I'm not sure that it's in any way constructive or accurate to think of the Tunisian experience from a perspective of political transition or detransition. I think that it's one of the experiences across the region that challenged such at least theoretical frameworks, and it's quite more complex than that. And in terms of speaking of political participation, and to go back to the idea of, okay, all this discussion in this way, how to move forward, etc. But it is happening under which political project? Yes, I think it's key. But when we look at the political landscape today in Tunisia, the current political project, well, first, does not present itself as part of any transition, but it's as a correction of a deviation. And second, it has a very different understanding of political participation. So the space it's offering for political participation, I mean, one would argue from like the facade, the only facade, that there is political participation still ongoing in Tunisia. But if you dig deeper, I mean, we've been like exhausted going through called to vote and participate in referendum and e-consultations, etc. But if you dig deeper, the reality is completely different. We were talking about the rupture between the state and the margins. And I think that we can talk also about a moment of truce. Like the current political project seized a point of culmination in 2021, and it got a carte blanche, but it doesn't mean that it's a blind acceptance of whatever may come. It's just a moment of truth. There's also behind it a lot of disillusionment, fatigue, etc. But the margins are still there in a sort of a wait and see. On the other hand, the current political project, the space that is offering for a sort of political participation is only to implement its vision of a new republic.
But just on this new republic, so you're not seeing any space for a discourse around more social justice, social protection. I mean,
it is a rhetoric.
It's a rhetorical.
It is a very present one, but it's really rhetorical. I mean, it's not only research if you live there, but it's really difficult to be there and have some distance and research these things. But at some point, you really want to believe that there is a vision, but if you try to examine things more deeply, there's none. There's a very strong rhetorical. So I don't think that, yes, and when you talk about political participation, under this political project, you cannot keep a blind eye on what's happening in parallel. That is the shrinking of the civic space, the dismantlement and marginalization of civil society and of organized political participation. So what space are we talking about? What dynamics to push for any socioeconomic change? And this change is led by whom, actually, and for whom? And what I wanted also to say that I don't think that the current phase is auspicious for such endeavors, but it doesn't mean that there's nothing to do. There's a lot to do, and how to prepare the aftermath probably of such a project. But I don't know if we will still have time to talk about CSOs in particular.
Well, maybe I will do one last round and then we open it to Q&A. But this time I'll ask everyone to really stick to maybe 1 or 2 minutes. And I'll start with you, Luca, and I'll come back to you, Cyrine. So hold this thought about the CSOs, but just really, if you were, in a minute, in particular, if you think of potential ways on path forward, on ways to overcome some of the obstacles. And it could be at any of the multiple layers of conversation we had, at the technical, conceptual, political, you choose something that you're like, actually, no, I see there's an opportunity, there's a potential alliance there, there's something, there's an interesting initiative there. What would that be? Oh, sorry, and actually, Sarah, I'll give you some extra time because I forgot to give you, my bad. I'll give you some extra time on that, but I'll go to Luca now, and then to you, Sarah, where you'll get actually 2 quick questions. But Luca, do you see any opportunities, interesting initiatives, interesting alliances, something that actually gives you hope?
Listen, I think definitely the new focus on social protection that Farah was referring to is something we have noted also from the, more from the international community side, this development of a new momentum regionally of new initiatives that are kind of putting much more, zooming on the focus more. And I can definitely confirm from the ILO, the interest in engaging more given the mandate for social dialogue, and they need to redefine really what social dialogue can mean in context where we're really trying to give voice to those many people. I like the term, we've used on the margin of the social contract. I just want to end with maybe and there is some hope, I think, also in some country-specific reforms that are being put forward. For example, the role of the disability movement in the launch of the National Disability Allowance in Lebanon is very interesting. There's been a lot of strong demand and capacity to coalesce on a platform amongst cross-sectarian disability movements in Lebanon. Interesting to look at that and support this idea of a national grant for persons with disability. I don't want to describe it as a perfect model. Is still externally financed, lots of sustainability issues, but interesting dynamic there. The other one I want to mention is Oman. Oman just adopted a really groundbreaking reform. It's a very particular context, but we're first country in the region to put together fully universal child disability and old age benefits and bring all social protection under one single institution, including with very big steps toward extending social protection to migrant workers, which is another very important agenda, especially for the Gulf, given current gaps. And the last interesting is Jordan, where we have worked with humanitarian donors to channel humanitarian funding through social insurance to give access to social insurance to refugees. Again, showing that there's not just cash transfers around. We can recognize the rights of workers, all workers, including refugees, to social insurance, and even use humanitarian funding to bridge, their participation in those employment-related schemes. So this is to say there is lots of work happening in the region, and I think the mix of this new movement and demand and also some steps taken by the duty bearers perhaps can open a new phase, or that's very much what we are working for from the ILO.
Thank you very much, Luca, and this is very encouraging. Sarah, and again, I apologize for taking away your right to a question at the last round, but and I'll merge the two questions. One is, I'm curious about what you're seeing. You're an advocacy organization. You're presenting the advocacy organization here, and the advocacy opportunities you're seeing both at the regional but also at the global level. So in a way, what are the challenges you're seeing? But secondly, if you're seeing any interesting opportunities, synergies, dynamics developing, and if so, at what level?
Thanks. This is the problem with targeted questioning. I think that luckily I think the challenges and the opportunities are in the same site. So it's easy to combine these two. I mean, I think there has been tremendous progress on recognizing the need for social protection or social security. And the real site of tension is around the word everyone. And most often the argument is because of lack of fiscal space. But if you scratch the surface, it exposes a much more complicated reality. And a big part of the issue is actually ideological. And I think this is because of a fixation with the word poverty as the social problem. The idea that if you make under a certain magic number, you're a social problem, that something has to be addressed. If you make $1 more, you're fine. And if you take a rights perspective, and this is where I think the power of a rights framework comes in, the concept of poverty is actually a meaningless concept. Because the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights is looking at whether public resources are going to the realization of a set of rights: health, education, adequate standard of living, social security, etc. And it's not trying to reach some magic minimum, but actually to ensure that public resources are going toward collective well-being rather than the benefit of the few. And if in that sense, it's actually a guide for reducing inequality rather than eradicating poverty, which is the framework that is very often used by institutions. So one of the major impediments to this sort of paradigm shift comes from, I want to pick up 2 points that were mentioned. The first was, I love what Farah, where you mentioned the mid-level social protection expert as part of the problem. But also what Luca was saying about how the World Bank understands the idea of social protection or social assistance. Because the World Bank is the largest supporter of social protection programs, specifically designing social protection programs outside of governments. And even though in 2015 they committed to universal social protection, the way in which they're actually going about implementing that is very much around this poverty idea, of poverty targeting. In the audience is my colleague Amos Toe, who wrote this excellent report on how the World Bank is using algorithms to sort of solve the problems that Luca was describing around poverty targeting and the problems with that. And so I think, where the opportunity comes is that there is a convergence outside of these technical institutions. And I should say with the World Bank is also feeding into IMF programs that are doubling down on austerity and other problems and using this very narrow idea of poverty targeted cash transfer programs as a way of mitigating the acknowledged impacts of austerity. So it goes beyond the World Bank. But there is a counterweight forming. I really am inspired by what Farah described, and I would add a few other kind of streams. And one is climate change and the need to shift our economies away from fossil fuels, and the idea of a just transition kind of gives new breath to how governments do that, and social protection is a really important part of that. And so right now, what I see is a fight, not so much whether there is a need for social security, but actually how we understand it, and whether it's a kind of cash transfer poverty targeted approach versus a rights-based approach. And I think that the climate groups, which are insisting on new economic paradigms that are not based on endless GDP growth, but actually looking at the allocation of resources within a society, is a powerful partner for pushing a rights-based approach to social protection.
Great. No, thank you. And I think thank you for bringing in the issue of the environment. I think it adds another layer to sort of our the need to kind of how we conceptualize social protection today. And I think it goes back, I think, to as well what actually Luca started with is, as we think about social protection, maybe it's not just a question of catching up to what was done in a sort of post-World War II model or even a bit earlier, but what is it that we even think about as economic development? That's probably for another session. But Farah, to you very briefly, I want to talk about a particular question, and Rana Jawad talked about it, that actually one of the challenges in the region, we want to talk about social protection, is the number of armed conflicts we have, right? Also occupation in the case of Palestine, and that is obviously a huge issue. And in those spaces, we see humanitarian actors being a key actor. And we saw Luca talk about how humanitarian actors, for instance, now in Jordan, are starting to think more about how their intervention should not just be about cash distribution, because again, when we're looking at displacement, this is not being, oh, there's a crisis, it lasts for a few months, and people go back. We're living in a sort of a poly-crisis time, and so the humanitarian actors become a key actor. And I want to ask you specifically about this, because I know you've been engaging with humanitarian actors to really get them to see how they can become key allies on pushing a rights-based approach to social protection. Can you tell us a bit more if you see opportunities there, in what form or shape, but in less than 2 minutes?
This is challenging, but yes, I'll try to do this. So basically, the short answer is yes. We are seeing a lot of, basically, you can feel that they are geared towards in this direction, and that there is a serious will on the part of international and INGOs and NNGOs, basically, so national and international NGOs, to adopt a more of a social protection oriented approach, and that they're being supported by donors, especially government donors, and especially when it comes to international NGOs that are of national origin, like for example the Danish Refugee Council, Norwegian Refugee Council. They are very much supported by their governments, because especially in the Arab region, and that is because I think they have realized that in the region we're living in conflict settings, and as we are, for example, if we are to look now at the situation in Sudan, if we are to look on Gaza, Yemen, Libya, Iraq, I mean, in such settings, conflict or post-conflict, it's a bit hard to now carve out or to think about establishing a social protection floor when we are living amid a humanitarian crisis. So I think this is where it's coming from, and they're like, a reaction to this is that, so since we have to be here as humanitarian actors, we cannot withdraw, then let's see how we can not harm the progressive realization of social protection, of universal social protection, because they are aware of this message. This message has reached them in a certain way, and you can feel it. They know that their interventions are very much needed. We cannot do without them in conflict settings, but at the same time, that if they keep intervening the way they are doing, they're only like making the state look good, stabilizing chaotic system, causing social inertia. So they have realized that. So they have basically joined efforts to see how they can link humanitarian assistance to development, humanitarian assistance to social protection, and have a more social protection oriented approach in their interventions. So there, for example, the Danish Refugee Council is partnering with us as representatives of civil society organizations in the Arab region to create such what I'm going to call a working group that will be leading a campaign whereby we're going to be helping INGOs and NGOs coordinate amongst themselves in their response to make it more social protection oriented and to link it more to whatever social protection system there is, and to have a more of a long-sighted approach instead of a reactive, short-sighted approach, and also to help this circle or network of NGOs coordinate with civil society, with academia, with those that have the evidence as to how we can make things look better. We're not the only ones doing that. The CULP network have such an ecosystem already established. We learned about it at a slightly later stage. Socialprotection.org, Luca is definitely part of this movement, is also leading work on this. So now the next step will be basically to coordinate, and this is what the Hub always does. We're going to be coordinating amongst each other, like all of us, to see how we can, again, join forces and make something that is more systematized. And I see these, and basically we're also linking this like kind of effort to our efforts, our advocacy processes. I hope I'll get the chance probably in the Q&A to speak about it with the IMF and the World Bank, because it's all related. Like the way foreign aid is being transmitted or channeled to the region is governing in large part how social protection, what form social protection is taking. And we see this, all of these like maybe, I'm not going to call them scattered efforts, but the different efforts on different aspects, I see them as what you mentioned earlier, Nadim, the non-movement movements, because these are accumulated gains that happen. So as we're working every day as NGOs, as a hub, we don't realize that we are accumulating gains because we don't see the short-term achievements of our work.
I'm actually liking this positive outlook from the panel. I don't know, Cyrine, if I'll just conclude with you. And again, I think my last question, maybe get you to reflect about, given the work that you have done and the organization FTDOS has done on the struggles of the disenfranchised, on the marginalized, and how do you create a social political moment? Do you see any opportunities there? I mean, I think you started by saying, and I think this will connect, actually, will be a good way to start our Q&A session by, I think someone asked a question online, and it got me thinking about it, which is, you come from the country that started the Arab uprising, right? And it was actually, it all started because of people working in the informal sector with their friction with the state and their right to dignity. And I want us to maybe conclude the conversation going back to that moment, which is we described a scene where the promise of something better did not materialize. You talked a bit about defiance of these social movements. Tunisia has now gone through a democracy where political parties were unable to reform or deliver. It's going through a very populist, shrinking space moment now. Do you see any opening politically for these demands? And if not, do you foresee, and I think it's one of the questions that came, do you see another wave of protest, uprising, or violence, or actually the moment will remain another form of protest, which is if people feel they cannot collectively protest, they will jump on boats and try to migrate. So maybe, get your thoughts about if you see any opportunities or any breakthrough, and if not, do you foresee another wave of contestation to demand more justice, but including particularly more social justice?
This is a super difficult question.
The easy one for the last, no?
Yeah, and to conclude on top of it. Well, I don't think first, I think that we need to free our minds and our imaginary from the 2011 moment, at least in terms of the form. And I know that moment is even more romanticized outside of Tunisia, and freeing your mind from it in a sense that to open prospects to imagine a different moment. It's with great difficulty that I'm accepting and adopting a stance or the argument that it's a process with its ups and downs, and we're at a low moment, but it doesn't mean that it's not moving forward. So, it doesn't mean that probably there will be like massive, like the same images again, but I think that we need to imagine a momentum, to think it outside of this picture, like try to imagine something that is not, it's not the streets or nothing. And the context is different anyway. The conditions that were there in 2011 are different today. 2011 also is not an isolated moment, nor any prospective moments. But what I wanted to say is that it is already happening. People taking boats and crossing the Mediterranean. I think that this is huge, like what's happening, especially in the past 2 years. It's been going on, and I think if you follow on a regular pace what's happening, especially that migration and undocumented migration today is a family project. It's not something that you do in secret from your family. It's the new family project instead of education, for example. And it's part of the discussion on social protection. It is when if someone succeeds elsewhere, then it might protect and support the group. And this is one of the modes of this informal space. So what's happening, and even you were mentioning also climate considerations, they are deeply changing and affecting and like exacerbating deep social mutations. It's difficult to imagine the moment, or I don't really have an answer, because also like these deep social mutations are still not fully explored. So there's a lot to do and I think that in moments like these, the role of scholars, civil society actors, is to really, it doesn't have to be always action. It's really to understand what's happening in depth with a lot of humility, like as if you know nothing about what you're exploring. But also one of the bright side of it, in a sense, or a positive note, is that there's a new generation emerging. It has its own codes, its own understanding of its future, new modes of action, organization, mobilization, a new discourse, completely different discourse. But at the same time, it's important to keep in mind that this new generation is rejects or is also in rupture with traditional actors, including civil society organizations. And I think that my generation and older generations should really give it space, should really listen to what's happening. Even if it's difficult to understand what they're saying at times, but I think that they do know the way, and it's also important to know that I talked about how vulnerability, the margins are expanding, etc. That this expansion is going hand in hand with the new social movements. I believe that the answer is there. We have no idea where and when, and. Yeah.
And I think that, thank you very much. I think this is important to kind of maybe leave us with a real questions about these new social movements. I think I also take away from you as well something very important to the debate around migration as a project for social protection. And I think connecting, I mean, not that we're going to open this debate now, but how, I think the failure to address some of these issues, create their own new forms. And I very much take to heart what you're saying, which is humility and taking the time to reflect. I think most of us working on these issues realize we're at a point of rupture. We know what's broken. We don't know yet what's coming. I think we've heard a number of interesting examples that there is experimenting, that there are alliances. Some of them might be old world type alliances. Some of them might be new world, but I think we need to kind of muddy through this challenge. And again, this is not to exceptionalize the region. It's very much, I think, in some ways, the region since, I think, 2010 has been, in a way, a canary in the coal mine. I think the uprisings that started in Tunisia spread to different parts of the world. The populism, the boomerang effect came back to the region, and so it continues. So I wanted to thank you and open it now to Q&A. To those watching us online, if you want to send any questions through the chat function, and it will be sent to my phone. For those of you here with us in the room in New York, if you have any questions, just have you to go to one of the mics. Introduce yourselves. I realize we're running out of time. If there are no questions, I'll give it another minute.
2 minutes per speaker.
Thanassi, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Thanassi Kambanis from Century International, and I'm loath to ask a question, knowing that it could trigger another 35-minute round.
We have to wrap up in 5 minutes.
Of thoughts, but I guess I'm left with a sort of despair and also conceptual confusion, which is after the region really erupted for many, many years of revolt, and really a colossal failure by the states in the region and also by the international community to really do anything differently in the result, in the aftermath of this crisis, which I see as a crisis of rights, and I mean of all the rights, right? The political rights and also the economic and social rights. And I guess I don't know if this is a sharp enough question, but I was really both you, Cyrine, and you, Sarah, you touched on this in ways that I found generative, but also I still feel kind of hopeless and without a map, right? So can you be a little more prescriptive, maybe a little more radical or direct or revolutionary, if that's your style, in saying, you know, we're all working on these issues. You're working on these issues. What is the most useful thing to do in the short term to change power, right? I mean, I'm all excited about cash benefits or cash cards or $50 to a household in Lebanon. I've even worked for such incremental outcomes, but it feels really mismatched to the moment, whether we're thinking about Gaza or whether we're thinking about Lebanon, where people are literally going hungry in a wealthy country. So, is that a good enough question to give you something?
So you want prescriptive. I don't know who wants to answer this. If you
even
feel like,
prescriptive for researchers, you know,
Yes.
like useful research projects.
okay, that's one question. Yes, please.
Do I really have to?
It's better because of the translation.
And the online people.
Yeah.
Okay. That's sort of, hello, my name's Barbara Adams, Global Policy Forum, ex-long-term UN staffer, I have to confess. Okay. It's triggered a little bit by the previous question, but also related to something overall. The meeting was framed around the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, or at least kicked off with it, and also on Article 22, and a very strong focus on rights. And yet I think there's also a very strong analysis here connected to obviously reality and experiences related to the failure of the state. So my question really is, are we really thinking even ourselves a little bit too limited when we keep on talking about rights, if we're also at the same time questioning this whole failure or inadequacy of the duty bearer of the state in certain kinds of ways? And are we then in some kind of, people keep on saying, we're in a moment with the old approach isn't working, the new approach isn't clear. Is it going to be clear? How do we work with the process? How do you situate the state and the relationship with rights in that old and new moment? Or I'm also teach, so if I'm being too intellectual about this, just don't bother to answer my question. Thanks.
We like intellectual. Please.
Hi, I'm Palak, and I'm a fellow with the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And I had a question. We've talked a lot about the role of the state, the shrinking role of the state, austerity in not being able to resolve this problem. I wanted to know if there are any other non-state actors who are actively campaigning against this or who do not want this to succeed just as the way that we are campaigning for it. For example, that I am interested in business and human rights. Is there any corporate sector accountability that we can look forward, that we can convince them or sway them, anything that we can work with in that direction, any non-state actors?
Okay, great. Thank you. No, corporate social responsibility. So I think we have three key questions here, and I wanna, because I'm also conscious of time, and I promised that we will actually wrap up on time. Maybe Sarah, you can start. So you have three questions on the table. Tanasi, maybe challenging the panel. Do you want to be more prescriptive? Do you want to be kind of, where do you see this going? There's also the question of, and I think this goes back to you, about your own reflection about the role of the state today. And finally, the question, I think, which really brings back of the, who's against this? And one word we didn't hear much of during this panel, and maybe it's the ideology of the panel, the role of the private sector. I mean, we heard it in brief, so let's do kind of a quick round robin of answers, and maybe pick the aspects you want to comment on. Maximum 1 minute. So we'll go Sarah, Luca, then Farah, Cyrine, and then I'll wrap up by thanking everyone.
So it's interesting because one of the challenges I was thinking of mentioning, but then didn't have time to, is that this issue doesn't capture people's attention in a region that's competing for attention around some pretty dramatic problems. And so in response to your question, Tanasi, I would say, I actually think it is extremely radical to get a government to finance social protection for everyone throughout the entire course of a person's life. I think that reconceptualizing, and this also gets to the question about failed states, it doesn't feel revolutionary. It doesn't feel as exciting as some of the other kind of very important causes across the Middle East. And I think that's a challenge, especially for an organization like my own, that is used to working on, mass atrocities and political dissidents who are in prison for many years. It's very plodding, technical work. But if we actually achieve a state that sees it as its obligation to provide benefits across an entire person's life course, regardless of their political affiliation, of their religious affiliation, of their nationality status, then we have achieved a massive revolution, and one that actually delivers more than ideas, but actually financial assistance to people. And to me, that is a worthwhile, it's radical enough.
Thank you. Luca, would you like to come in?
Yes, talking about state capacity, I lost a bit connection because of electricity going down here in Lebanon. But I want to, I think, come in and building on the last comment here to say, and maybe speaking a bit specifically on Lebanon, I really, what's the alternative to the state? I think we need to ask ourselves that question. And I can tell you, in the absence of a state, or in the context of an almost failed state here in Lebanon, the alternative is indeed private sector, but in the way that increases inequality in a way that is unprecedented. I mean, we have basically a failed social security system, and the haves who purchase private insurance and the have-nots were left without the health coverage they enjoyed prior to the crisis. So really the question is how to engage in a demand for the state to reflect this new paradigm in the loans they negotiate with the World Bank, because indeed they are negotiating loans with the World Bank, and those loans bring money that is used for a certain type of social protection and perhaps could be used for building foundations of another type of social protection, which indeed breaks those links of patronage and puts citizens, ideally we would say residents, at the center of a duty bearer right holder relationship. And I can say that I lived through the crisis of Lebanon for the past 5 years, and in the midst of a complete failure of the social protection system to deliver any form of protection to Lebanese citizens, if anything, the social movements have put a stronger social protection at the center of their demands. The hope is that through the work you are doing and in collaboration with some of us, that can lead to at least some of the duty bearers to take responsibility for this agenda moving forward.
Thank you, Luca. Farah?
Yes, thanks, Nadim. So I'm going to only answer the part that is related to the role of the private sector, and it's also related to corporate social responsibility. Actually, in one of the main advocacy processes we're pursuing with the IMF and the World Bank, we are covering this very much. And I really would have loved to speak about the process itself, but time flies. But speaking about privatization, the World Bank follows since 2015 the cascade approach, which is basically to maximize development using private solutions. And it's doing this very invasively. It's even commercializing the most essential services, like even electricity, water, and everything. And this, if we are to think about social protection as income transfers and as social policy more broadly, this is an impact on social protection to begin with. But also by privatizing, we know that multinational corporations and the corporate field have benefit from a lot of tax exemptions, tax evasion. They have their own tax havens, basically, and this is also preventing social protection reforms, because the key alternative solution to finance universal social protection is tax reforms that are on the side of corporate taxation instead of indirect taxation that affects the poor. Second, by this wave of privatization, we're seeing more informalization, because the private sector, in the formal sector, you can have informal labor, and the private sector is always prioritizing the informalization of labor, and this has also got bad repercussions on the level of social security, especially we do not have in the Arab region corporate social responsibility frameworks, and if they are not binding and they are not enforced. The World Bank is privatizing social insurance and is privatizing social pensions. So basically they're privatizing the administration of pension systems, and people are opting for that because they do not trust public systems, as I mentioned earlier. And the private funds where the pension money is going, go to the stock market. And this has a lot of bad repercussions on the pensioners, whether because of the high cost, the high contributions, or because of the return on investment, basically, when they retire, that it is very low. There also, for example, if we are to think about the World Bank Group more generally, the IFC is also investing a lot in the gig economy. All sorts of gig economy, although these are first multinational corporations like Uber and others, and although on the second part, we do not even have the legal frameworks for such precarious kind of work. So we're investing in the gig economy, and we are promoting this way job insecurity and social insecurity at the same time. So this is a key problem, I think, in the region. Yes.
Cyrine?
Well, I don't really have anything to add. I was trying to think of something radical. I don't have enough time to think about it. I think that we missed a word when talking about, especially, to echo what Luca was trying to say, is this shift, rethinking basic notions, and this shift in understanding at several levels, but also on the other side, we tend to forget a key element, that is ownership. We're discussing things and designing things and trying to understand what's happening at many levels, but then I think that we should at some point leave it to the very natural dynamic between the central power and the rest of stakeholders. At some point, we need to understand that our role in this field has to stop, and other actors would do the rest. Just a tiny comment. I personally do not believe that there are such a thing as a failed state, but this is a very wide, long debate. Sorry?
Failure is not the same as fail.
Yeah, well, even as a concept, especially in the MENA region, there's behind it why and what's behind this word in particular, and it can be very informative for the discussion. But this, I'd probably need 2 hours.
First, I just wanted to thank the panelists, thank again Ford Foundation for gathering us, thank the attendees in person and online. And I'll just say a 1-minute conclusion, I think, to go back to Tanas. I think the challenge for us today is to be able to think on multiple levels at the same time. And to go back to the region, I think one thing that's clear, obviously it's not a uniform region when we talk about the Arab region. And when it comes to social protection, we see on the one hand, for instance, Gulf countries that are actually implementing these things, based today, though still mostly on an oil-based economy that's doing well, but that is actually, they're upgrading it, moving away from subsidies, so we've seen the Emirates remove subsidies on oil towards other sort of profits. We are seeing as well other countries, Luca talked about Oman, but we could also talk about the efforts in Morocco and to a certain extent in Jordan of trying to muddle through, improve certain things. And it's very interesting here, and this goes back to the one of the questions that came up: why Morocco and Jordan? And as a friend of mine tell me, the monarchies have longer time frames, right? They are preparing succession, so they know if they don't get this right, they will be leaving an inheritance that is unstable. So they are taking steps, and they're willing to experiment. And that now leaves us with the other group of countries, you know, the ones that are living in war, that are living in conflict, that are living under occupation, that are living under terrible governance. And that is probably the most challenging one, because it becomes, at least to my mind, a bit of a chicken and egg problem. You know, do you need to have stability first, and then you can start redelivering and rebuilding the social contract? Or do you get to stability by building through and by delivering on things like social justice? And one element to do it would be social protection. I don't have an answer to that. And I think for me, a research agenda, particularly for those of us, and I know, Tanasi, you're one of them, working a lot on Iraq, Lebanon, and others, is to think about these issues, because it is truly, you know, nature hates a void. So people in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Libya will find alternative solidarity mechanisms. But if they're not state-based, then that space makes it harder for the state to kind of come back and be present. And so where does that leave us? And I think Exhibit A is Lebanon. You know, the communitarian reflexes come back to the fore. So I don't have an answer to you, but I think it's a very fascinating research question of, is stability a precondition to start delivering state-led social protection, or the state has to reoccupy some of that space as a pathway to stability? I don't know, but I just want to thank everyone for a great conversation, and hopefully stimulating more questions than answers, because that's probably a good thing, particularly when we're in these moments of massive dislocation and transition to what we don't know yet. Thank you, and thank you again all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.